Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the JPN podcast. Today, I'm lucky to be joined by Rabbi Laufer. Rabbi Laufer is the program director for the Certificate in Jewish Bioethics at YU. He did his Smicha and Dianis through the REITs program under Rabbi Blythe and Rabbi Willig. He also received his master's degree in bioethics from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in conjunction with Cardozo Law School, and most importantly, specializes in the intersection of dementia and halacha. Thank you so much for joining us today. And without further ado, Rabbi Laufer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. So for those of you that are just listening in, there's reference to the slide that I'm sharing here on my screen. But for those of you that are with us this evening, feel free to join along. So what I want to talk to you about this evening is really what I call the introduction to a very complicated sugya, one that's really never been comprehensively explored or written about in Halacha, and in fact is what we would generally refer to as a giant mess. The problem with dementia is that really it's not just dementia, it's really all forms of cognitive impairment. We have a term for it in halacha, which is called shota. The problem is that when we try to apply the criteria of what is a shota in halacha to different types of disease processes, it becomes extremely difficult, especially since depending on the area of halacha, the criteria seem to change drastically. Especially when you start stacking up different areas of halacha in the same person against each other, it becomes even more complex. So we're not going to have the sufficient bandwidth tonight to go through all of the particulars and details across all areas of halacha. That is the subject of my forthcoming book, which will hopefully be out later this year on the subject. But in the meantime, I think what behooves us to do tonight is really maybe the most practical aspect of the conversation around dementia. And it's also the surface level. It's where everything begins, but it's definitely not where it ends up. So without much more introduction, let's get into the discussion about what the halacha has to say about dementia and where it all starts. So really when we talk about dementia and halacha, we're really talking about a mashup of two different sugyas that conflate into one giant problem. So of course, the first one that we have to talk about is, of course, the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em. The Torah tells us in Parshas Yisro, in the Aseret Hadibros, kabed tzavich l'asimecha l'man ya'arichun yamecha l'adama asher Hashem Elokecha nosim lach, that one must honor their father, this and their mother and their potentially older siblings and maybe their grandparents and other important people in their lives. That is the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em that we are all familiar with. However, there is a counterpart to the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em called more av v'em, which is the fear of your parents, and that comes from a pasuk in Parshas Kedoshin, ish imo v'aviv tira'u, a person must fear their parents. And keep Shabbos, ani Hashem Elokeichem. And of course, Rashi cites the famous Gemara on this pasuk where Rashi tells you that, of course, you have to listen to your parents because you fear them. However, when they tell you not to listen to God, so then God comes first, because divrei harav, but divrei hatalmud, divrei mi shilman. Rhetorically, Rashi, in the name of the Gemara, asks the question: when your teacher and when the student tells you to do opposite things, you never listen to the student sitting next to you in class telling you to throw spitballs. You listen to the teacher and tells you to pay attention and learn something. So, of course, when your parents tell you to violate Shabbos or to do anything else against the Torah, then obviously God's commands supersede that of one's parents. So we obviously already understand the tension between the ideas of honoring a parent and always listening to a parent, because sometimes those things are not always the same. So, of course, this becomes the function of the Gemara's dictums in describing what are these two mitzvahs. So the Gemara Maseches Kedushin breaks it down, Taner Rabbanan Ezehu Mora Be'ezehu Kibud, right? What are the things that constitute fear and what constitutes honor? So Kibud is actually a very short list, maybe counterintuitively, but the mitzvah of Kibud av v'em is actually limited to very specific things, and they all seem to be about physical care for a parent. Ma'achil umashke, you have to make sure they have sufficient food and drink. Malbish umachasa, you have to help them get dressed and make sure they have clothes with which to dress themselves. Machnis umotzin, you have to make sure that they can get to and from wherever it is that they want to go. Now, if you just wanted to summarize what the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em is, it's to basically make sure that the basic physical needs of a person are taken care of. Now, of course, the Gemara points out that one is not even obligated to spend their own money on these things for their parent, but rather their parent has to spend the money from their own pocket. And it's just that the child is responsible to ensure that these are the things that get taken care of. So when we're looking for someone to assist in making sure these things happen, it is the responsibility of a child to make sure that these things happen, but it is not the child's financial responsibility. But again, these things are very limited, right? If a parent would per se decide they needed jewelry, so jewelry is not on the list of kibbud, right? If a parent wanted to go on vacation, that's not necessarily within machnis umotzi. Machnis umotzi sounds much more, mundane, much more like I need to get to the store, I need to go to shul, the basic everyday things that a person does. Extraneous things do not seem to be included in the mitzvah of kibbud aveim. On the flip side, we have the mitzvah of mora aveim from the pasuk of Ishimo Vel Tirao, and the Gemara tells you things that you can't do. Mora includes lo omid bimkomo, you can't stand in the place of a parent. Velo yoshi bimkomo, you can't sit in their chair. For those of us like myself that grew up, in fear of ever sitting in one's father's seat. So this is the source for that prohibition. Velo soseres devarav, and you may not contradict a parent. Maybe on a group of 800 people, I shouldn't say that. I'm not so good at that one. Velo machrio, and you cannot be the deciding vote when your parent has a disagreement, even if that's between two parents. You cannot be the deciding vote. You can help to see each side, but you cannot be the one to cast the deciding vote and say, I think that the other one is correct. Now, the specific particulars of each of these categories is not so much our focus this evening, but the idea of mora aveim, obviously, if we were to boil this down into one core concept, is that one must show deference to a parent. That means that when a parent is interested or in a conversation or asks you to do something or tells you to do something, so generally speaking, the understanding is that you must obey. Again, as we will see, there's limitations to this, but within the prohibition of violating the fear of one's parent is inclusive of all the things that one must do when a parent commands a particular request. So, what do we do with this information? So, one more thing before we move on to why this is so important, which is that not only are there mitzvos that require us to obey and to respect our parents, and generally speaking, to show them deference, but it's much more significant than that. The Gemara actually equates the mitzvos of kibbud aveim and mora aveim with a number of different other ideas. And I think this Gemara actually nicely encapsulates, as you will see later this evening, everything that we're going to be talking about tonight. So the Gemara Maseches Kiddushin, it's rather famous, says as follows. Tanu Rabbanan. Ne'emar kabed es avicha v'yasimecha. The Torah tells us that one must honor their father. V'ne'emar kabed es Hashem mehonecha. And it also says that you have to honor God, who gives you everything. Hishva hakasav kibbud aveim l'kibbud hamakom. The psukim in Tanakh equate the mitzvah of kibbud aveim with the mitzvah of honoring HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Statement. This is a fact, right? We must honor God, certainly the same way we honor our parents. Ne'emar ish imo v'aviv tirao, v'ne'emar es Hashem elokecha tira v'oso savod. Just like one must fear their parents, so you must also fear and serve God. Right? It's telling that, of course, when it comes to fearing God, it includes the words v'oso savod. You have to serve God. Right? You don't have to do everything for a parent, as are the limitations established by the mitzvah of kibbud aveim. But nonetheless, broadly speaking, within the category of mora aveim, you generally have to do that which parents tell you. Hishva kasav moras aveim moras hamakom. Just like you fear God, you also have to fear one's parents. Ne'emar, a third thing, mikalel aviv v'imo mosimas. It's a capital crime to curse a parent. V'ne'emar ish ki kalelo Eloha v'nasa achato. That if a person curses God, he carries his Aveira. Now, this is not the V'nasiva Amcha Lo Sa'or, Elohim Lo Sekalel. This is not the prohibition of cursing a leader of Klal Yisrael, but rather this is actually cursing God himself. Whenever we refer to cursing God, Chas V'Chalila, the Gemara refers to it B'Lashon Saginar by referring to it as a bracha, because we wouldn't want to actually write such a thing in the Gemara itself. And of course, you cannot obviously curse God. Aval B'Haka, but when it comes to comparing the injuring of a parent to the injuring of God, Vadai Afshir. That's, of course, impossible, right? The Torah does not need to combine and compare and contrast Make Ava V'imo Mos Yumas to Make Elokav. That would be crazy, because one cannot, of course, injure God. So there's no need for the Gemara or for the Psukim to relate the two ideas together. And of course, this is the famous part of the Gemara, that it's telling that in logic, right, all three are partners in the creation of man. Tanu Rabbanan, there are three partners in the creation of man. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ba'ava V'imo. When you carry out by the mitzvah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to honor one's parents, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Mala ani aleim kilu darki b'neim b'chiduni. It's as if I myself, God says, am there living amongst them. So the idea being, of course, just on a surface level, that there's obvious significance between the mitzvah of honoring one's parents and, of course, the way we treat HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the way we follow his mitzvahs. However, there's certain pieces of this Gemara that are very important to take note of. The first is, of course, that the Gemara seems to reject the notion that we need to compare Maki Ava V'imo to Maki HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, of course, Vadai Yasher, meaning the fact that it's impossible is obvious. So why did the Gemara even need to tell me? Meaning, would anyone have thought when reading this Gemara that there was a missing pasuk from this comparison list? Probably not. right? If I was reading the Gemara, okay, Kabed Asavicha and Kabed Hashem, I understand. Mora Aveim, Mora Hashem, I understand. Right? Even Kilal Aveim and Klal Hashem, I understand. But Haka never would have been all Daitcha. No one would have ever thought that that was something that we have to consider. And yet, the Gemara sees fit to point it out specifically that it's not on the list because it's impossible, almost implying that were it possible, there would be some kind of comparison that we would have to think about. So that tells us something when we see the next Gemara that we're going to take a look at. The next thing that's important to take note of here, of course, is that when the Gemara actually says Sheshlashta and Shutzfinbo, right, that they are each partners, the Gemara then cites this idea that it's Kibbud Avein that brings God into a person's living space, right? It's weird for the Gemara to highlight Ki'ilu Darti Beinehem V'chibduni, as if I was living amongst them, right? It's kind of a bizarre comparison, right? That Shachanti B'socham, right? That God is going to be amongst us. God is going to dwell as a central figure or as a central presence, right? Some form of Klal Yisrael level thing. But it's very, 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 very specific, which is that it's amongst the people that are honoring their parents to whom God decides to live amongst them as well. So the question is why? Why is this so significant? So I think that's really what we're going to be driving at this evening. We try to figure out what the halachos are of taking care of a parent, especially when that becomes more challenging as cognitive and serve as a physician for a parent. And that's really the next Gemara we're going to be looking at, which is, so here are the number of questions that come up all the time, right? And this is not just for parents who are suffering from dementia. These are for all parents, which is, where is the best place to take care of that parent? Should you put them in a home or in a facility, right? Especially when parents start to lose their cognitive executive function, it becomes very difficult to keep them at home. It becomes costly. It needs a lot of full-time support and staff, and it becomes very taxing on the people who are living there, right? Who should actually take care of the parent? Is it better to keep them at home with an aide or two or three if that's financially affordable, or is it better to put someone in a facility? Should you put the parent into someone else's room, or should they move into a child's home and live there on a semi-permanently basis? It becomes very difficult. That can tax someone's marriage. It can tax someone's family life. It can become very challenging when there are children, when there may not be enough square footage to house everyone effectively. Up all the time, right? If the child is the primary caregiver, so this happens all the time, where you see a very devoted son or daughter taking their parent to shul back and forth all day, always taking care of that parent. So what happens in the event of a medical emergency? So what if the parent falls? What if there is a cut or a broken bone or a severe injury, or even if it's not so severe? Who takes care of those injuries? What can or can a child not do in such circumstances? So if there is such a facility that would be appropriate in that case, and it's actually very challenging, although becoming more possible today, but still extremely challenging to find a facility that conforms to a person's standards of halacha. And for someone who still retains their cognitive capabilities, that's a non-starter as an interest. They will, of course, want to go to a place where they can attend minyan, where they can have kosher food, things like that. As a person loses their cognitive executive function, they may be less capable of standing up for what they value, but ethically, maybe it's something that we need to consider anyway. And that's before we even ask the question halachically, what should we consider when taking care of these people? So these are some of the broad questions that I seek to answer this evening, because these are the questions that come up all the time. Now, of course, this does not in any way preclude the questions of more significance as we approach the end of life. But the reason why I like to start here is because, as it turns out, the most important questions that end up never getting asked, or getting asked and being improperly answered, due to both the lack of the understanding of the nature of the illnesses that are in the general rubric of dementia. And to this group, I don't think I need to explain that dementia is not actually a disease; it's just a description. But try explaining that to a bunch of rabbis who've never heard of the brain before, and it becomes very complicated. So it's not so simple, and especially when we start asking questions that people tend not to think about, even when they are in full cognitive health, which is, when was the last time you looked at your will? And did you write a halachic will? Are you still capable of writing a halachic will, or do you no longer have das? Do you no longer have the halachically governed capacity to engage in such a document? What about giving gifts to children and grandchildren? What about the simple things such as putting on tefillin? Are you able to keep guf naki if you are male? Right? What about there are all kinds of questions along these lines. What happens when a person requires someone to take care of them financially, and they need to appoint a guardian to oversee the distribution of their assets? So what are the parameters of that guardian to make decisions on what and what way and what behalf on behalf of whom and who should have input on those things. So these are some of the more complicated questions that come up, but it usually all starts at home, which is where most people discover that they are in the process of a disease that causes the symptoms of dementia. So here is some of the basic statistics that I think most people are probably familiar with, but it probably makes sense to just review them quickly, which is that most elderly patients suffering from dementia, traumatic falls can cause severe injury and oftentimes do cause severe injury. In fact, most elderly patients that are on some level of MCI, moderate or mild cognitive impairment, to severe dementia, a broken hip from a fall is the most traumatic injury they will suffer within 12 months of them suffering mortality. There are specific risk factors that increase likelihoods of a fall in patients with dementia, which is, of course, all the things that are noticeable to the people who care for them. And, of course, the fact that most people do not have the time, nor the expertise, nor the financial wherewithal to redesign their homes in order to be safer and more reasonable for someone with severe cognitive impairment. So it becomes very challenging to keep someone at home, even if that is the common and most likely scenario for people, certainly in our community. Falls obviously increase significantly as dementia progresses, right? It's 47% more likely when you have Alzheimer's disease, 77% with Lewy body dementia, which, probably spell it right. Lewy body dementia, which of course impacts one's ability to the frontal lobe and other movement disorders. And of course, 90% more likely with Parkinson's disease, because Parkinson's is a type of cognitive impairment that specifically targets physical movement long before it gets to the executive centers of the brain, which of course means that in all of these types of either early or late or mild or severe forms of cognitive impairment, injuries are going to happen. Parents that we care for, relatives, family members, friends that we care for are going to be injured just simply by going about their daily lives because they're not capable of protecting themselves as well as they used to. Now, sometimes it's just from old age and slow reflexes, but it doesn't help when your brain is slowly disintegrating or being interfered with by various proteins and other such substances that one can find in the brain. And I'm not here to weigh in on the efficacy of treatments that may or may not do anything. We know they don't do anything. For dementia and other dementia-causing diseases, we've known this for about 25 years, and we're still about 20 years from being 20 years away. I used to say that when the New York Times writes that have a breakthrough in dementia care and medications, it means that we're 20 years away from being 20 years away. But I've recently taken to saying that when you see every 6 months, the Times of Israel wrote that somebody came up with a new treatment that may one time in the future come up with a cure for dementia, it just means that we're 40 years away from being anywhere in dementia research. And God willing, we should see much more breakthroughs much sooner than that. But in the meantime, we're nowhere when it comes to treatment, medically speaking, of dementia, which means that we need to deal with the realities of people who are suffering from diseases that cause dementia. And the greatest risk for their physical health will, of course, be a fall. And a fall is going to happen. And almost always it's going to be with someone who is at home, such as a family member taking care of them. So what do we do in such a scenario? And in fact, the Torah tells us exactly how to govern this scenario. So the Torah tells us, "Umake avav v'imo mos yumas," one who injures a parent is chayav for a capital crime and shall be put to death. And of course, the Gemara tells us in the Sanhedrin that misa is misa skila, which is stoning to death. Now, of course, this is the one that the Gemara declined to use as a comparison to God, because of course one cannot injure God. But nonetheless, it is obviously significant as it's a capital crime to injure a parent. So the Mishnah tells us, the Gemara ultimately says this is a machlokas, whether it's chenek or skila, and it goes on through a whole sugya, etc. But we pass it and it ends up being skila. But the definition of injury for a parent is until you make an actual injury. And of course, the injury that the Gemara describes is where you cause blood to pool. So that means that you have to cause a bruise or cause an open wound, some nature of injury in that way. So the question that the Gemara in Masech Sanhedrin, and this Gemara is actually invoked in numerous different sugyas for different reasons, because it comes into play for different types of sugyas in medical ethics. But the one that we're going to discuss tonight is actually for the specific and pashut pshat in the Gemara, which is, can a child physician treat the medical malady or injury of a parent? So the Gemara is asking the following question: Ben mahu shiyakiz dam la'aviv. What is the permissibility of a child being the bloodletter for a parent? Or if we wanted to update this to a modern form, could you take the blood to run routine blood tests or be the surgeon for a parent? So you might be an excellent phlebotomist, you might be an excellent surgeon, you might be an excellent physician. Are you allowed to engage in whatever medical treatment it might be that is needed for your parent? So the Gemara cites the machlokas between Rav Masna and Rav Dini. Rav Masna Amar v'ahavta l'reach hakamocha, and you should love your friend like yourself. And of course, the implication of Rav Masna's position is that just like it would be expected and permitted to care for your friend who needs your medical care, so too you should also do the same thing for a parent. Or almost in other words, Rav Masna seems to consider the fact that when one would want to bloodlet for a parent, that's the normative medical care that you would expect to give. So it does not count as injury in any way, shape, or form. However, the Gemara cites second opinion, and this seems to be the opinion that most of the Rishonim and most of the poskim cite la halacha, which is Rav Dini's opinion. Rav Dini bar Chinna Amar make adam umake behema compares the injuries that a person may cause to their fellow man to that of the property of their friend. Ma make behema l'refua pater. If you injure an animal while trying to care for it, so if you're trying to fix a broken hoof and you end up breaking the leg, so you're pater. You don't have to pay for the damage for the injury towards that animal. Says the Gemara, according to Rav Dini, af make adam l'refua pater. If you injure a fellow Jew while trying to heal him, you will also be pater from any damage that you cause. Now, the reason why this Gemara comes up many other places is because this formulation, of course, speaks very much to the sugya of malpractice in Jewish law and whether or not halacha actually shields physicians or may not shield physicians from any liability in the event that a mistake or even an unwanted outcome occurs during medical treatment. But what we want to talk about tonight is actually, does this actually weigh in on treating a parent? So Rav Dini's formulation does not imply that it's permitted. He implies that if one were to potentially injure another person while trying to treat them, then you would be pater for that damage. Now, what that tells me in the simple reading of the Gemara is, of course, that by definition, if you're letting the blood of a person, or in today's day and age, doing a basic medical treatment, even if it's for the benefit of the patient in question, it's still injury. You're still cutting into someone. You're still causing a technical injury. Even if that injury on the whole is beneficial, and therefore we encourage, allow, or even require such a treatment, nonetheless, on a technical level, it's still a form of injury. So even if normally you would be pater from any damage that comes out of that injury because the expected benefit far outweighs the expected damage that's caused, and therefore, for whatever the svara might be, we would allow it. So does that truly apply when it comes to one's parent? So the Gemara says two stories. And the Gemara says as follows. Rav lo shavik lebrei lemishkali silva. Rav would not allow his son to remove a splinter from his finger. And Mar bre Ravina lo shavik lebrei, Mar the son of Ravina, would not allow his son limiftach lekivsa, to lance a boil, to drain it of pus. Dilma chado. And in both stories, the Gemara refers to as saying because there's a potential for injury, v'havale shigas iser. The Gemara already tells you that the way I interpreted Rav Dini's position is not the way the Gemara is interpreting it. The Gemara is rejecting that. The Gemara is saying it's not that the specific medical treatment might cause injury, but rather doing what you need to do in order to fix the problem might cause further injury. Now, when it comes to bloodletting, that still might be considered injury because whereas the case of pulling out a splinter or lancing a boil to drain pus, so none of those is actually causing, per se, bleeding due directly to the fact of what injury you caused. Any bleeding that comes would be subsequent to your particular medical treatment. Whereas bloodletting, the entire treatment might be to cause damage. So again, that's maybe beyond our discussion this evening. And the Gemara says, there's obviously a concern that you're going to potentially violate a prohibition in the Torah by causing injury to the parent, one way or another. The Gemara asks, if that's true, it should be prohibited for any Jew. Okay, it's the Machlokas Rashi and the Rambam, what the source for injuring another Jew, why it's prohibited, what that source for such a prohibition is in the Torah, whether it's Lo Yosef or Pen Yosef, with the Sukkim about Malkos. But either way, everybody agrees you're not allowed to injure another Jew. So if that's true, it shouldn't be permitted for any Jew to bloodlet for any other Jew, lest they come to injure the person. The Gemara says no. Acher shigas lav. When it comes to another person, it's only a regular lav, it's a prohibition. And a regular prohibition, okay, so we're not concerned about that potential prohibition. However, beno, when it comes to one's son, shigas chenek. That is a capital punishment. Okay. That's capital punishment. So we understand now why these Amoraim did not allow their children to treat them. not because per se it's fundamentally prohibited, seemingly along the lines of Rav Dimi's suggestion, but rather because there's a concern that it would go too far. Something would happen, even in the course of treatment, that would be considered to be an injury. And even if you're putter, so it's a violation of a capital crime b'shogeg, we try to generally avoid such things. That is the conclusion of the Gemara. Now, the reason why this is important is because what it tells us is that you actually can, when all else fails, treat a parent. But it has to be when all else fails. And in fact, that's exactly how the Rambam formulates this halacha. The Rambam says, Hamak is dam la'aviv shahei rofe. Right? If a child is bloodletting for a parent, or the child is the physician, v'chatach lo basar o aver, and amputates, or does some other form of surgery, pater. The child is exempt, not chayiv misa. Af al pi shehu pater. Nonetheless, says the Rambam, even though you are exempt from the chayiv misa, lechatchila lo ya'asa. O lahotzi sila mibasar avin lo imo lo yotzi shemi yasa chabura. Lechatchila, you shouldn't do these things, not even to take out a splinter, because you may cause damage to the parent. So when would it be permitted? Says the Rambam, when is this true? When is it true that lechatchila, that you should not be the one to engage in treatment of a parent if it's avoidable, is when there's someone else to do the job. If there's only you, the child of this parent who's injured, to treat the parent, the Rambam adds a second criteria, which is, and the parent is in pain. So why would you need to be in pain? So it's obvious. The reason why the Rambam includes pain is because that shortens your time horizon, right? If the parent is fine and it's annoying, but can make it to another physician, then you can find someone, right? Sheisham acher lasos might mean that there's nobody in the room. But if there's somebody in the next room, so then go get the guy from the next room. Or if there's somebody down the block or in the next town over, so just go there. But that's always tempered by what the medical reality is. And the Rambam tells us that it's not just the concern for their medical condition, but it's also for their level of pain. And that if going to the next town is going to leave a parent in discomfort or even pain, that would be inappropriate. And then, the physician should do whatever is necessary to treat the parent. So we already see that when it comes to kibbud avayim, there's a fundamental expectation of the halacha that parents are to be treated as regular patients when all else fails, which means if a parent with severe dementia were to fall at home, so if there's only one person there and it's relatively urgent, so you take care of the parent, help get the bleeding cleaned up, stitch up the wound if it's severe, whatever it is, and then call whoever you call to take care of that parent so that you can step away. Just want to point out, since this is a physician's network, that it's also good ethics to do that, since despite the fact that all Jewish doctors that I know treat their own family members, the AMA does recommend highly not doing that since it's unethical. But just as an ethicist, I feel like I should probably say that out loud. You continue to do whatever it is that you do. And my Rebbe would be very angry at me for saying that, because we need more Jewish doctors to care for all Jewish patients. And who are the doctors that you need most? The ones you're related to. That's what Rebbe Willard would say. So, okay, I've done my duty. I've given you the two bounds of this of the way to think about this. But nonetheless, the question that I'm really interested in is not just when do we have to treat parents, but of course some of the challenges that come before the fall happens when it comes to treating a parent with dementia. And that brings us to what I believe is the only narrative sugya that the Gemara gives us where we have a story that illustrates exactly this problem. And that is what we're gonna have right here. So that's the Gemara here in Maseches Kedushin. The Gemara says as follows. So three parts to this Gemara, and we'll break each one down as we go along. So the Gemara says as follows: Rav Asi havaleahi imma zekena. The Gemara's girsa that we have is that Rav Asi had an elderly mother. Okay, so Amrale, she said to Rav Asi, her son, who is a big rabbi, "Ba'ina tachshitin, new yingala, I need new jewelry. Go to the store, buy me some new earrings." Okay, avad lasi. He went, he got her new jewelry. Ba'ina gabra, she says to her son, I want a new husband. The old guy is dead. I want a new guy. Okay, so na'ayin lach. He went to meet to the shadchanim to see if there's any shadchanim that knows somebody for his elderly mother. But then it becomes a problem. Why? Because then she doubles down. She says, "Ba'ina gavra de shapir kavasach." I need a guy to marry who's as handsome as you, my dear. Shavka. So Rav Asi says, "Okay, I've had enough." Mailing it in. Shavka. He left her. Va'azal la'ara di Yisrael. He runs away to Eretz Yisrael. Rav Asi was originally in Bavel, and eventually he travels, due to this story, to learn by Rabbi Yochanan in Eretz Yisrael, which is why Rav Asi is one of the early Amoraim who actually is a crossover, very commonly found both in the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, because he's a Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan. But he started off in Bavel as a Talmud of Rav and Shmuel. He's in the second generation of Amoraim. So Rav Asi, again, it's become much more difficult today because we have cell phones now, so parents can annoy you from far, far, far away. But in the old days, if you ran away to another country, that was pretty much a good way to get away from an annoying parent. So Rav Asi does that, right? Giving rise to many generations of young, budding Jewish students running away from their parents to go study in Israel or live in other countries or other places, right? So Rav Asi is the precedent for this approach. So you run away from a parent. Okay. So here's the end of the story, though. Here's the postscript. Like any good parent, not going to just leave well enough alone. So she comes after him. So now Rabbi Asi comes to his Rebbe, Rabbi Yochanan. Amar lei, and he says to Rabbi Yochanan, Mahu latzeis mi eretz l'chutz la'aretz. The halacha the Gemara Masechet Subas tells us that one is not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael except for very specific exceptions, none of which is kibbud avayim. So Amar lei, so Rabbi Yochanan correctly tells Rabbi Asi, Asr, you're not allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. You made Aliyah. You came to learn here in Eretz Yisrael. You obviously came to learn Torah in my yeshiva. So clearly, none of the exceptions that might be applicable to you are valid here, and you cannot leave. You have to stay. So says Rav Asi, okay, likras ima, but what about to go after my mother? So Maut. So Amar Lai, so Yochanan says to him, Eini Odea. I don't know. It's a legitimate question. I don't know the answer. I always, personally, I tend to read this Gemara the way Rav Shechter would read this Gemara. Eini Odea? I don't know. Could be. We'll see. So Rav Yochanan, I imagine, very much knew the answer and just did not want to share. Which is why the next line of the Gemara becomes very telling. Utarach portas. He waited a little bit of time, which, as any YU guy knows, that's exactly how you ask Rav Shechter Shlita questions. Other also, so you come back and ask him a second time. You didn't like the answer you got the first time, try again a little later. Amar le. So he comes back to Rav Yochanan and he says, Asi. So he doesn't even have a chance to ask the question. And Rav Yochanan says, Asi, Misratis, let's say, so you want to leave so bad? You want to go home? You don't want to be in yeshiva anymore? Fine. Hamakom yachzircha l'shalom. God should return you in peace. In other words, go goodbye, zaygzut and stark, or not, just get lost. So also the kamed Rebbe Lazar. So Rav Asi now comes to his buddy, his Talmud, and his Rebbe Rebbe Lazar, who's like the second in command in the yeshiva. Amar le, chas v'shalom, dilma mirsach rasa. So Rav Asi is concerned. Maybe I made Rabbi Yochanan angry. So Amar le, so Rabbi Lazar says to Rav Asi, my Amar lach, what did Rabbi Yochanan say to you that you're afraid that you made him upset? So Amar le, so Rabbi Asi responds to Rabbi Lazar's query. He said, Hamakom yachzircha l'shalom. He said to me, God should return you in peace. Amar le, so Rabbi Lazar says back to Rav Asi, V'im isa derasach, and if it's really true that he was angry at you, lo hava mevarech lecha. He would never have blessed you. Now, how do we know that that's true? Because we know that when Rabbi Yochanan gets angry, people die. Because we know from the story of his old chavrusa, Reish Lakish, who once went too far in questioning Rabbi Yochanan's position, that Rabbi Yochanan killed him with his angry eyes. So clearly, if he was actually angry, Rav Asi would not have made it to this conversation with Rabbi Lazar. So when he says, "Hamakom yachzircha l'shalom," we know it's not a curse that Rabbi Yochanan lays on Rav Asi, and that's exactly what Rabbi Lazar tells Rav Asi, don't worry, you're not cursed. So adahachi v'hachi. So whilst all this story is going on, Shama, Rav Asi heard la'arona de ka'asi, that his mother's coffin is on its way. It's not that she's chasing after him because she wanted to annoy him, but rather she had died, and now her coffin was on its way to Eretz Yisrael to be buried. Amar, says Rav Asi, iyadai, had I known that when I left, or that I planned to leave, she would already be dead and on the way, Onafki, I never would have left to go. Now, if we work backwards, this becomes very problematic because this Gemara is very vague. Amar iyadai lo nafki, what's had I known I never would have left? Is it that had I known that she was dead, I never would have left the yeshiva? Or is it that had I known that she was going to die, I never would have left her in the first place? Right? And of course, depending on what the result of our reading of this last line will impact our entire understanding of what Rav Asi is really asking Rabbi Yochanan. Right? Is he asking Rabbi Yochanan, listen, my mother was nuts, she was driving me crazy, so I ran away. But like I shouldn't have done that, so I need to go back. Is it allowed to go back? And then Rabbi Yochanan might be legitimately telling him, not really, you should stay, because even though you left under not great circumstances, maybe that was the appropriate approach. Or alternatively, maybe he's asking Rabbi Yochanan, listen, had I known that she was really sick, I didn't think she was sick. I thought she was just driving me nuts. But had I known she was sick, so then I never should have left in the first place. So maybe it wasn't even a question. I should have gone straight home. I shouldn't be asking at all. Right? And of course, there are many different approaches in the Rishonim and Achronim how to read this Gemara. But I think the most important point for us is, what's the nature of Rav Asi's mother that he's running away in the first place? right? We learned earlier this evening that the mitzvah of Mora'av Ve'im requires one to not only listen to a parent, but also to provide for physical needs. Rav Asi's mother is asking him to help provide for her physical needs. So what gave him the right to abscond from fulfilling the mitzvah of kibbud avayim in such a scenario? So there are actually two different approaches of how to read this Gemara. So the first comes from the Machlokus, the Rambam and the Rambam. So the Rambam tells us, and the Achronim point out that either the Rambam does not give a source for this particular formulation of his halacha, because the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim does not tell us where he gets this from, but it seems to be that this is the only Gemara in Shas that makes any sense for the Rambam to be basing it on. But the Rambam's formulation is his own words, not the words of any Gemara in Shas. But the Rambam says as follows: Mi shenitrafa da'ato shel aviv shel imo. Fear of da'at is one of the many ways that the Gemara refers to a decline in cognitive abilities. Someone whose cognitive abilities are impaired. Their parents' cognitive abilities are impaired. Mishtadel lenhogi mahem kifi daitam ad shirucham aleim. You should work with the parent. You should do your best to take care of the parent until HaKadosh Baruch Hu has mercy on that person and regains their cognitive abilities. V'im efsher lo la'amod v'pnei shenishtatu b'yoser. And if it's just impossible for the child to handle whatever is going on, yanichem, leave the parent. V'yelech lo, leave. V'yitzave achirim lanhigam karai lahem. And tell other people to step in and take care of this person. That's the Rambam's position, right? So if we were to go back to the Gemara for a moment, right? The Rambam is obviously reading the Gemara as being Rav Asi did his best. He tried to help. At a certain point, it got too far, so he had to leave. Now, the Gemara doesn't tell us what he did once he left, but the Rambam's presumption is, okay, see, he told somebody else to step in, right? If she needs something, make sure it gets taken care of. The Ravid, of course, though, has a very big problem with this. Amar Avram, Ein zu ha'ra nechona. This is an incorrect psak, because in hu yelech v'yaniach lo, if Rav Asi leaves, l'mi yitzav l'shamro, who could he command to take care of his parent? Right? If you told me that the mitzvah was to hire someone, okay, fine. But that can't be the mitzvah, and the Rambam himself knows that, because the mitzvah of kibbud avayim is mishal av, not mishal ben. You only have to pay out of the payments from their parents' money. So if they don't want to pay, you can't force them to pay. So how could the Rambam suggest that you just tell someone else to take over for you? And the Ravid is incredulous. How could that be the psak? So this becomes problematic because many of the Rishonim do not pass in like the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch cites the Rambam verbatim that we should just, you should leave and you should tell someone else to take over. But the Ravid and many other Rishonim think that this is incorrect. And most of the poskim seem to go against the Shulchan Aruch here, as we will see. So trying to understand the Shulchan Aruch's psak and the Machlokas, the Rambam and the Ravid about this Gemara, we have two very interesting sources to look at. So the first is, here, let's take a look at the Bach first. And then we'll go back to the Radvaz and the Merkav's Mishnah. So there's two groups of thinking about this story. So the Chidushi Bach suggests as follows. He says as follows: Haranu ubal migdal oz kasush devarama mehin talmud aruch mehadar of asi havlayim ima zekena. Okay, everybody thinks that the source for the Rambam's ruling is this Gemara that we learned about Rav Asi's mother. Gama Beis Yosef hiskimi mahem ushlo ke'aravid. The Beis Yosef also agrees with the Rambam and not with the Ravid. Va'ani Omer das Ravid he, and says the Bach, I want to explain to you the shita of the Ravid. Okay, dahi ima lo nitrifa daita. She was not impaired. She did not lack capacity on a cognitive level. Elazakena Isa. She was elderly, not impaired, as the Gemara itself tells us. Right, the girsa we have in the Gemara is ima zakena. It says the Bach. That's very telling. She's not miturav das. She's not a shota. By the way, the Gemara always tells us when someone is a shota or miturav das or at risk for that. So for the Gemara to go out of its way to tell us that his mother was elderly, that implies and not impaired. Since he couldn't find a husband of sufficient worth in her eyes for her, right? So he left because he can't do anything. There's nothing for him to do, right? It becomes uncomfortable. There's nothing he can do to fix the situation. So why stay and constantly be in violation of the request of his parents? He's not able to do what he's supposed to do in that scenario. So he leaves because if he can't hear from her, so then he can't violate her commands. So there's no bittul, at least in the mitzvahs of kibbud avayim and moravei. Says the Bach, that someone who is impaired, they need extra care. It's It makes no sense to leave them. Since you cannot be considered to be chayiv, to follow their commands, because again, they are no longer capacitated. They lack the ability to make rational and reasonable judgments. And therefore, you don't have to fear any punishment for violating mora aveim or kibbut aveim. Share ein lahem da'at, because these parents do not have capacity. V'im kain einu mechoyev ki im lahachilam ulahashkotam ulashamram. You're only chayiv in that scenario to take care of their basic physical needs. You don't have to listen to their requests, but you still have to provide food, water, shelter, things like that. So how could you leave? Says the Rav, so how could you leave? You're still chayiv in the midst of kibbut avein. You can't not leave. You have to be there. You can't go anywhere. It's uncomfortable. You want to leave? Fine. So then you could leave. You're not chayiv to be around. But if there's nobody to care for that parent, of course you have to be around. V'chein yira midivri Rabbeinu, says the Bach, and this is what the Torah actually says. Shehiskim l'das Ravid v'hachi naktinan, and says the Bach, this is how we paskin against the opinion of the Shulchan Aruch. That you can leave when she is impaired. Says the Bach, you cannot leave when she is impaired. That's the opinion of the Bach. But there's a more interesting and even crazier, if I dare say, read of this sugya, which is that of the Radvaz, and is explicitly stated by the Merkavas HaMishnah. The Radvaz says, "Uvdi Ravasi Kavla Ima Zakena Shevkav Azal Eretz Yisrael." Right, Ravasi left, doesn't want to deal with. Says the Radvaz, I have no idea why the Ravid doesn't like the Rambam. Why? Even the Ravasi of an Uvda Benafshe, Ravasi did this himself. Right? What's the Ravid's concern? How could he have done this and left his mother all alone? Right? Ravasi left his mother with no care? Right? It's very yeshivish. Right? Of course, Ravasi, the great Ravasi, would never have ignored the requirements of the halacha. And of course, he paid to make sure that somebody was taking care of her. And he gave commands, and he made sure there was a trust fund, and everything was set up. And that's what he did in order to take care of her. Why? Because she is fawning over him in an inappropriate way and not embarrassed of this, right? So he can't be the one to take care of her because it's inappropriate. Right? Which is not going to be the case if it's not someone who's related to her, right? If it's just an aide who you hired, okay, so she's a little bit inappropriate because she's impaired, so that you understand that's part of the job, and that's okay. So now you've taken care of that person. And says the Radvaz even furthermore, why should Ravasi, of course, have left his mother? Velo matzi ligorba, because you can't argue with her. Va'achirim gorimba, but others can actually yell at her. Ve'efsher al yidei haka'a tachzor mishtusa, and it's possible that if you beat her, she'll stop being crazy. Umaisim b'chol yom b'chiyotzi b'zeh, and this happens all the time. Now, if you know anything about the history of dementia care, and for this I recommend a book written by one of my mentors, Dr. Tia Powell, called Dementia Reimagined. I highly recommend this book for those who have not yet read it. It's a fantastic work on rethinking the way we care about for patients with dementia in today's day and age. But if you go through the history of dementia care, until the mid-1900s, the overwhelming majority of medical treatments for people with forms of cognitive impairment, whether that be psychosis or other mental illness, or even age-related cognitive decline, the primary medical approach was beating the living daylights out of the patient with sticks, often with chains, usually incarceration to follow, etc. Which I'm pretty sure we all know is really not a great way to care for people who need our help, right? So aside from the fact that, of course, this is a violation of kibbut aveim and mora aveim, and the Merkavas HaMishnah spells it out, right? Right, and to go even a step further, right, to literally restrain a parent, not just to yell at them or, God forbid, to hit them, but to literally physically restrain them in order that they don't have freedom of movement because of what their cognitive impairment is forcing them into. So there are obviously two ways of reading this Gemara, right? We have this approach of the Bach, which is that, of course, if a parent is impaired, you have to take care of them. And on the Radvaz, of course, that the Rambam is right, that you have to leave and let other people do it because you can't care for the parent. So what I'd like to suggest is actually that they're not arguing. That in fact, the way to read the Gemara and that the Rambam and the Ravid seeming machlokas is in fact not a machlokas at all. What they're actually saying is that one way or another, you have to do what's best for the care and treatment of that parent. And for anyone who's ever dealt with people's severe cognitive impairment, Depending on which inhibitions go, patients can sometimes become violent, in which case you may need to medicate or restrain them. Not physically abuse a patient, chas v'chalila, God forbid, but to treat them the way they need to be treated might require of you things that can be done by others. So if a patient will be best served by staying at home and being cared for lovingly by a child, then of course, both the Rambam and the Ravid would agree that that's the ideal. But in the event where the best medical care, a la the way the Radvaz and the Merkav's Mishnah in their time conceived of it, but obviously would update medical protocols for our times and what we know is to be better medicine, would still require things that might be prohibited according to the Rambam himself. Because if there's someone else who could do it and there's no physical pain for the parent, right? So then, of course, you need to get someone else to take care of that parent. And in fact, the Tzitz Eliezer has a tshuva, which I'm just going to summarize here, where he actually says the same thing. The child that was asked him was a young man whose mother-in-law was suffering from dementia, unclear what the cause of the dementia was. And his wife wanted her mother to move in with them. And it was causing all kinds of trouble, all kinds of stress, all kinds of things. And the Tzitz Eliezer actually ultimately points out that they can and should have her in the home right up until the point where they no longer are able to care for her properly. At any point where she needs to be restrained because she's causing damage to the people, she's hitting people, whatever it is. So then at that point, they need to find either another place for her to live or a facility, a home, or to get someone else to come in and take care of her, because just because she lacks cognitive abilities does not actually allow for the halacha to say that we can now physically restrain or injure a parent. Because of course, those are scenarios where other people can step in. In fact, there's a whole industry for other people to step in and take care of the parents. So the opening ideas that we have to think about when we're talking about caring for people with dementia, before we get into the questions of who does and who doesn't have capacity, how do we assess capacity? What is capacity? Under what circumstances should we restrict a person's decision-making abilities because of perceived lack of capacity? And all the questions that come with what is a shota and how does that apply in today's day and age? The first question that we really need to think about is, what are we actually being asked of when we're talking about caring for our family members? And that's why I want to bring your attention back to the Gemara that we spoke about this evening, towards the very beginning, which is that Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Mala Ani Aleim, Ki Ludarta Beineim B'chibduni. That when we do kibbud aveim the appropriate way, when we take care of parents the appropriate way, when we do our best to get the best medical treatment, sometimes that means taking some personal difficulties for ourselves in the care of parents, and then knowing when our limits have been reached, that we have to transition into the next stage and putting parents in the scenario that is best for them. That's what brings HaKadosh Baruch Hu into our lives. That's what actually allows us to fulfill the mitzvah of kibbud aveim and the mitzvah of mora aveim in the most appropriate and proper way. So with that, I conclude, and I want to thank you very much for listening and for having me this evening.
Thank you so much for coming on. I can say I didn't know anything about this topic beforehand, so I felt like I learned a lot, and I hope anyone who saw this live or will watch this in the future will learn just as much. Do you mind? Well, two questions. One is, in the last case with Tzitz Eliezer that you brought down, would one go so far as to say that if you're having, if it's causing marital strife, right? It's causing problems at home. In a very holistic way, one could say, well, that's definitely going to impede on your ability to care for your parent when there's a little bit of a resentment there, and it's causing trouble in your home. Would that point in the favor of then, well, maybe you're not taking care of the best care of your parent because of that?
Yeah, so like all things in life, I think it's a balance. And obviously the case that we're in the specifics of the case will always weigh significantly more. And I probably should have started with that, which is that whenever a medical halacha shayla comes up, the specifics of the case will always far outweigh in importance any particular principle that we may discover or want to apply. But the idea that I think that Eliezer is really driving at, even if he doesn't say this explicitly, I'll say it for him, is that we have to find the right balance. And obviously, if you live in a home where everything is like clockwork and any disruption to that home is going to create all kinds of problems, so then that's not a scenario where the parent will be able to get the best care. But I also think that if that's the type of home that we're talking about, then you should take a good hard look in the mirror and think about, well, what kind of mitzvah kibbud aveim are you setting an example for with your children? And I think that's part of the balance, is knowing when, and again, that's something that has to be constantly reevaluated. At the beginning, maybe you try, and if it's not working, so then you have to shift strategies. There's no hard and fast rule for these things. And even within the broad, description of, generally speaking, Alzheimer's dementia, which is the most common form of dementia, is approximately a 10-year process from onset, or what I should say, onset of symptoms, is probably the best way to refer to it, till mortality. Um, but usually these things tend to become severe in the home, around 3 to 5 years into the dementia process, and usually by the seventh or eighth year, it's no longer feasible to keep that patient at home. So the question is, in that interim, from year 3 to year 8, though, during those 5 years, where's the spectrum? And it really depends on the progression of the dementia. You have patients whose dementia progresses to the point where they lose their inhibitions and they become very childlike. So they giggle all the time. They're very happy. They think that everything is funny. They almost revert to a very childlike, a toddler stage, which generally speaking means they can be kept at home indefinitely, because as long as someone can physically care for them, there's really no impact on the day-to-day functioning of the home life, assuming, of course, that you have the structural capabilities to do that. If someone's inhibitions in terms of restraining violence and become very, antagonistic and combative, so then that pushes the horizon up a lot. So it really depends on the scenario. But I think the point is that it's a constant reevaluation, not just in the eyes of what's best for the patient, but also what's best for the family. And everybody has to give a little to get a little. And that's why I think it's important to remember that if you want HaKadosh Baruch Hu to live in your home, so then you have to do the mitzvah kibbutz of aim well, right?
And then I was wondering if you can share your slide. I think you shared some of the common questions that come up first, and I was wondering if you could just walk us through one or two based on some of the things we discussed tonight.
Sure. So let me just pull that back up. So is this the slide you were referencing?
Yep, right in the beginning here.
Do you have a particular preference?
Well, I don't want to, we do have people here live. Yeah, I'll leave it up to you,
Okay. So
Dealer's
I'll
choice.
So I think the easiest one to think about is the last one, which is, if a facility is an option, what qualifications should the facility have from a medical standpoint? So I think there's the famous truth of the Chassam Sofer that I imagine most people who've ever had to deal with this type of a shaila are familiar with, which is, again, not exactly the case of dementia. The case of the Chassam Sofer is dealing with is a 12-year-old girl who from a Frum family in Pressburg in Hungary, who was suffering from some form of mental illness that was apparently treatable. But the institution that would be best served for her needs, that would be able to treat her and return her home, was one that served Nevelos Utrefos, Charfos. And the question that was posed to the Chassam Sofer was, is it permitted to send this child to that place, given that she will be able to be treated? And then the Chassam Sofer, amongst his analysis of the sugya, kind of develops this unique approach, which is essentially he applies the framework that we use for Shabbos, which is mutav shechal Shabbos achas kadei sheyishmer Shabbosos harbe, that one should violate Shabbos now so that you can keep Shabbos in the future. He more or less applies a similar approach to the case of that young girl, and says better to get her treated now, because if there's some hope for her in the future, then we want her to get treated so that she'll be able to fulfill mitzvos, because right now she can't do mitzvos. And if we leave her in a facility where she won't get treated, she'll never be able to fulfill mitzvos. So we would like her to be able to regain that treatment. So when we're talking about in terms of dementia in the modern age, we have a similar question. How far extending in terms of both care for a child, in terms of your relationship with a family member, and cost do you have to go in terms of making sure that a parent has the ability to follow halacha, at least in terms of even the food that they eat and drink? Earlier stages of dementia, patients are still entitled to eat and drink food. They're not swallow risk just yet. And it's reasonable to say that you should want to serve them kosher food. The problem is that, unfortunately, most facilities that serve kosher food are also not often the ones that give the best care. And oftentimes they may not be close to where the family lives. So is it important to have, regular visitors, things like that? So these are the issues that come up in the analysis of these questions, and the particulars are always going to matter.
Yep.
Who the patient is, what is important to the patient and their family, right? And we also have to weigh the fact that the patient, depending on how severely impaired they are, might already be patur from mitzvos, in which case putting them in a scenario that's best for their care, even if it violates the potential obligation of the community, which is to provide that person with kosher food, because based in mitzvah lahafer shekatan from nevelos utrefos, for example, but that may not be best served in this person's interest at that time. So that's one of the ways that we have to think about these questions about facilities, and what might be in best care. So these are some of the questions that come up all the time. And of course, they only get more complicated as we progress towards the end of life. And as you ask more rabbis who are ill-equipped to answer the shilas, there are very few rabbis that are familiar with the details of both the sugyas and the medicine and the practical ethics and the way the hospitals work. These questions become very, very complex. I always like to tell people that when dementia shilas come in, I always ask how many siblings there are. So in your average case, your average Jewish family, average mono-Orthodox Jewish family has about four siblings in the family, and possibly a spouse. So let's say there's 4 or 5 shul rabbis that are going to be involved in this case. That means that there's going to be no less than 12 different answers to any question that's asked, because the rabbi that you asked the first time, by the time you ask him the second time, doesn't remember what he said the first time, so he comes up with something else. And there's no real framework for addressing these questions. So one of the things that I'm hoping to do with my upcoming sefer is to at least sketch out a framework for analysis of how we should go about thinking about these questions in a halakhic sense, right? The easy questions are, when do you take away someone's tefillin? Should you make davening, brachos, things like that? Those are the low stakes questions. The bigger stakes questions are, what do you do about halakhic wills, right? If a parent who turns out has severe dementia, well, they signed a halakhic will 3 years ago. So is that halakhic will valid, or was it impaired? Did they have the das to make that decision? Did they not? Right? What if they start giving away money to tzedakah? Can the tzedakahs accept it? What if they show up at a store and they buy jewelry for their wife? Is it the obligation of the store owner to refuse service to this person, because if they do, it's theft? Because if you take money from a shota, it's stealing. It's gezel. It's a Mishnah Maseches Bava Kama. So these are the issues that have to be thought of, and unfortunately, oftentimes we don't. So that's really where this sugya really kicks off a much greater, much broader discussion.
We'll have to have you on for an advancement of this conversation. But again, thank you so much for coming. As a great talk. I mean, we're happy to have you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It was an honor to be here.
All right, everyone, take care. Thanks for joining.